אוקיי, guys. ערב טוב לכולם, אנחנו בוובינר בשיתוף אוניברסיטת רייכמן ומכללת הגיגיה של המרכז לבריאות הנפש גאה, ויש לנו היום אורח שמיד נציג אותו. Before we start, I would like to ask you to be silent for 1 minute in memory of all the victims of this conflict. The innocent and civilian victims, and also soldiers. We just lost 2 soldiers today. And also for a quiet prayer for the return of all the hostages. Let's take 1 minute for this. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This talk is one of a series of talks that we are going to have in the next few weeks because we have to. And we want to educate ourselves in the treatment of trauma, acute stress disorder, acute stress reaction, and PTSD. We are going to have Edna Foa next week, and we will announce it to all of you. Today with me in the panel is Hamutal Saragusti, who is a clinical psychologist, senior clinical psychologist from GEA Hospital, that doing her PhD on IPT and suicide. Professor Anat Bronstein-Klomek, she is the Dean of Psychology at Rייכמן University. And I'm Gil Zaltzman, I'm the Director of GEA Mental Health Center and the Chair of Psychiatry at Tel Aviv University. And Anat will present our distinguished guest, John Markowitz. Anat, please.
Thanks, Gil, and thank you, John, so much for joining us. It is a real pleasure to present John, who's a friend and colleague, and I'm very excited to have him. John is a professor of clinical psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University and New York State Psychiatric Institute. John created IPT for post-traumatic stress disorder, so it's a real privilege to have him expose us to this treatment. And he was just the previous president of the International Society of IPT, which I have the pleasure to be with John. So John, thanks again, and I'm leaving the stage to you.
Okay, thank you. It's hard for us to know exactly what's going on over there, but we feel for you. We feel for everybody. What a terrible situation. So I wish I could see, I saw that there are 60 odd participants at last count. It would be really nice to know what your experience is. I wish I were there so we could talk about this. With PTSD, I mean, I think you live in a traumatized country. There's, even before this, there was more trauma we're used to here. So, you know, you're all clinicians, you all know IPT to some degree, is that right? And you
everybody know what is it, but most of the people don't practice it.
Don't. Okay. Yeah. That's what I wanted to know. So you know, I imagine many clinicians in stress disorder, and there are different ways to treat it. And predominantly what's been done is exposure therapy. Edna Foa should really go before me, since she developed prolonged exposure well before IPT came around to this area. And exposure therapy works really well if you can get people to do it. And that's sometimes a challenge because we'll talk about why. Okay, and there are many of you, I imagine, have a cognitive behavioral or a psychodynamic background. And so that, I don't know where that leaves you for PTSD. There are various cognitive behavioral therapies for post-traumatic stress disorder. I know my wife is working on an adaptation of trauma-focused psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is a time-limited treatment. It's still getting sort of preliminary testing, but it looks like it works. But that's not typical dynamic therapy either. So anyway, whatever your background, I hope this will be useful. I have to give you my disclosures. I'm a psychotherapy researcher So I don't have a lot of big disclosures, no drug companies there. I just picked one picture at random from your recent events. It's really painful to see what happened. It's sort of breathtakingly awful. What happened, what, a couple weeks ago now, and what's been happening since. So you are all confronting tragedy. I just came back from a Civil War battlefield. This is a big topic of interest in the United States. I visited Antietam battlefield, which is where more Americans died in a single day, 22,000 from both armies, the North and the South, in a single day, fighting over a couple of acres of land. It's very somber and moving to go there. General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the Union heroes of the war, said, "War is hell." People congratulated him on being a hero, and he said, "Don't kid yourself." That's Sherman. War entails huge events, deaths, torture, kidnapping, displacement. All kinds of big things happen. And when things happen to us, we have strong emotional reactions. And the strength of the reaction should be proportionate to the size of the event. If you get if you cut your finger, that's not a big deal. You may be unhappy. Village or kibbutz is blown up, you're going to be more than unhappy. And those huge emotional responses are very difficult for some people to tolerate. In fact, they're difficult for all of us to tolerate. Some people try to process those feelings, and some people say, this is too difficult and dangerous. My feelings are bad. I'm going to suppress them as much as I can. And that's one way to think about PTSD. Because it doesn't work. The feelings leak out anyway. But you spend a huge amount of psychic energy just trying to keep things together, while internally and externally your life is also falling apart. So some of the big things we see in psychiatry following war trauma is major depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and grief. And interpersonal therapy, which I'm going to be talking to you about, is really effective for all of these areas. In fact, interpersonal therapy as psychotherapies go, is fairly simple. It's based on the connection between what's happening in your life and how you feel. That seems elementary. That ought to be elementary. It's not elementary to a lot of people. And it's really not elementary to a lot of people who are depressed or anxious or traumatized. Even though they know upsetting things have happened in their lives, they disconnect the way they're feeling from their external circumstances. And then instead of saying, oh, something horrible has happened to me and I'm very upset, they say, I have two problems. The world is awful and oppressive, and my internal life is awful and oppressive, and they don't really make the connection. They're getting hit from both sides. So what does war bring? It brings death. And one of the things that this therapy focuses on is complicated grief. That's a form of major depression following the death of a significant other. Or you can have just regular grief, which is painful enough following the death of a significant other. Or, as I understand what's happening in Israel, many significant others. There are other losses, separations. These are things that evoke sadness and in extreme depression. Social supports, which we know are really important to mental health. get disrupted. You don't have people to turn to necessarily. And being able to turn to people in a crisis is really important. So these are problem areas in which we focus our treatment interpersonal therapy. So death there's a whole focus of treatment, the whole brief treatment, which lasts 12 or 14 sessions or a similar number of weekly sessions, focuses on the death of a significant other and how hard that is to deal with. A role transition is any kind of major life change. Thinking you're in a safe country, relatively, and then feeling, how did this happen? We were completely overrun and slaughtered. People, as I understand it, have moved out of bordering settlements in Israel and to hotels and other places more centrally. That's a major displacement. And in the midst of this, people fight with one another, and instead of getting support from one another, they get into struggles, and we call those role disputes. And these are all common things that happen to people. People die. That's a big, bad life event. Things change. A role transition, that's a big, bad life event. And people disagree and struggle and fight with one another. And those are what we call role disputes. So you can focus treatment on any of those things. All of these events evoke powerful affects and emotions, and particularly negative affects. Sadness comes with loss. Anxiety comes with threat or uncertainty. Anger comes with being mistreated or abused. So what's PTSD? I hope you know about it. You should. It's really important to look for trauma with patients. If you don't, they may not bring it up. Even if you do, they may only bring up lesser traumas because they don't want to tell you about the really bad ones. They're more likely to tell you about an adult trauma than a preceding childhood trauma. So you want to dig in taking a history with patients and find out, have they been traumatized? Because it changes the game. It really changes your strategy. There are characteristic aspects of PTSD which you may miss if you're not thinking about it. PTSD is prevalent, it's debilitating, it's often chronic. It's technically chronic in the DSM if you have had symptoms for 3 months. But most people wait years to get help. On average, something like 8 years. And in the meantime, they suffer and the people around them suffer. So important to identify this early and to treat it early. And there are good treatments. What's the best way to treat it? Look, pharmacotherapy, serotonin reuptake inhibitors reduce depressive and anxiety symptoms, which are part of the constellation of PTSD symptoms, and they help many patients. What they don't do is to shift your mindset. If you've been traumatized, you are really scared of the world in one way or another. And I don't really think that SSRIs change that. They may mute it. They may mute the anxious response, but they rarely bring about real remission because your outlook is really part of what makes PTSD so awful. But pharmacotherapy is certainly important to consider. You can combine it with psychotherapy. And the combination is never worse than monotherapy. PTSD treatment has been dominated by exposure treatments. And that's what you're going to get from Edna-FOA. And that may be what you get, that's prolonged exposure. Or that may be what you get if you learn about EMDR, which is exposure therapy with some bells and whistles attached. Or you can do cognitive processing therapy, which it started out as an exposure therapy. Patty Reese, what's her name? Patty, anyway, who developed it, changed it a little bit and said that it's no longer an exposure-based therapy, but it fundamentally is. What these therapies do is to make you face your traumas. It's a very simple conditioning Pavlovian paradigm. If you're scared of something, if a threat appears, you have a fight or flight reaction. And people with PTSD have definitely chosen the flight option. So they say, this is awful. I can't deal with this. I just want never to think about the trauma I've experienced. And if you can get the patient, and first of all, that doesn't work. If you try not to think about something, try it. You start thinking about it. But also, the thing about PTSD is I remember 9/11 in New York City. That pales before what you guys are going through. But it really left a mark on a lot of people. Not everybody got PTSD. But I know the color of the sky on October 11th. I will never forget that. And I'm colorblind. But I know that kind of a day. There are certain smells people will associate with a situation. There are colors, circumstances. You know, Lower Manhattan is still very scary for some people because that's where it happened. So not only do are you trying not to think about things, but everything starts trauma, and then you start avoiding all the things that are associated with the trauma, and pretty soon you're avoiding everything. So what exposure therapy does is say, you gotta face those fears. We'll start with the easy ones. And when you get used to the fears, if you go to Lower Manhattan, you will see it brings up bad memories. It's very upsetting, but there's no danger there. There are no buildings going to come down right now. So if you put somebody in contact with the stimuli they fear, which are associations with PTSD, they will habituate to them, and the things they fear no longer are so fearful. That's exposure therapy. It's hard to do that with a war going on, by the way, right? Because the threat's still there. And for years, exposure therapy just dominated the field. There was a dogma in the field, really, that if you want to treat PTSD, you must do exposure therapy. And there are like 8 of them at this point, maybe more. It's very unusual for a psychiatric disorder to have only one effective treatment approach. If you think about major depression, you can do IPT, you can do CBT, you can do emotion-focused therapy, you can do a form of dynamic therapy, you can do medications, you name it. So why should there be only one approach to PTSD? This was our trauma in New York. That I remember that skyline. It took me years to adjust to that not being the skyline. And I didn't have PTSD. I just was traumatized. Other forms of abuse, trauma. And this is where you are. So, but in the beginning of trauma treatment, there was PTSD, there was CBT, which is exposure treatment. And that's really dominated the field, and it really works. And Edna Foa will give you a convincing picture of the many, many studies that have been done showing it works. Mm-hmm. But it's not the only approach. Okay, I think I've said all this. It doesn't work for everybody. It has high attrition because you're asking people to face their worst fears. And even if you do that in graduated fashion, some people say, sure, bring it on, but a lot of people are afraid to do it. And some patients with high levels of dissociation, which is part of PTSD, when they try to do the exposure homework facing these fears, if they're dissociated, they may just get re-traumatized. They're not really sitting with the situation, and that may actually make them feel worse. So there are basically two different kinds of psychotherapies. There are exposure-based therapies. That's the fight and flight model. You expose people to an upsetting stimulus and let them habituate to it, and it becomes not so bad. That's basically a CBT paradigm. These are structured treatments because if you want to systematically expose people to things, you have to impose a structure. There's a lot of homework. And you have to build up a hierarchy of fears and habituate to them in increasing intensity till you get to the worst. And when you do that, the PTSD is gone. It's symptom focused. These therapies focus mainly not on the patient so much as on the patient's symptoms, the syndrome. And there's a lot of homework. And if you do your homework, you get better. And if you don't do your homework, you don't get better. So we came up with a different approach and a dynamic approach to psychodynamic approach to PTSD is also an affect-focused approach. And there's something called present-centered therapy, which is a more affect-focused approach. Instead of focusing on fear and stimuli and facing them, this focuses on how do you feel? What are your emotions? Because what typically happens in PTSD is that patients suppress their emotions. It's just too uncomfortable. If you go through something horrible, you're going to have a very, very strong reaction. And if you have a strong reaction, you have a choice. You can say, this is awful, but it's proportionate to what I've lived through. No wonder I'm upset. It's kind of the IPT approach. And that those feelings actually tell you something. They're not random. They're not bad. They're saying, you've just been through something ghastly. It's a danger. So patients are the ones who tend not to be able to tolerate those feelings. They suppress them. They go numb. When we first started doing this research, we thought, maybe this is repression in an analytic sense. Maybe these patients really don't remember what happened there. Maybe they really don't know how they feel, and it's not true. They are suppressing at enormous cost how miserable they feel, how scared they feel, how angry they may feel, how sad they may feel. These are overwhelming emotions. They say, not for me, I will go numb. And the problem with having no emotions that you can access is you can then not read other people. So one of the really bad things that PTSD causes is, particularly if it's an interpersonal trauma, if somebody does something bad to you. So this is Hamas for Israelis, and this is Israelis for Palestinians, to put things crudely. You don't trust people who hurt you. And if you, but the way you figure out whom can I trust is by trusting your feelings, because not everybody's untrustworthy, right? But you lose that specificity with PTSD. You really end up not trusting anyone because you're not reading your feelings. You don't know, is so-and-so trustworthy or not? So in consequence, patients with PTSD withdraw socially. They are very aloof and emotionally withdrawn from other people because they don't want to get hurt again. And they can't distinguish who might be safe and who might not be. And this is one reason that people with PTSD tend to get re-traumatized, because they're not reading their environment. And so they can't tell safe from dangerous. If you don't trust any other people, that takes away your social supports, right? Even people who might be on your side, you're saying, not you, I don't trust you either. You're not going to get a lot of support from them. You're not going to allow it. This is a much more experiential attachment paradigm, not a cognitive behavioral one at all. It's less structured, because unlike an exposure paradigm where you want people to face a scale of different fears, what you're really interested in this kind of treatment is, how do you feel about things? What is your emotional range? What's your emotional response? How can you use those feelings to judge the world and figure out how to survive? Figure out who's trustworthy and who's not. So it's much more person-focused than symptom-focused. Although obviously, if this didn't treat symptoms, it wouldn't be a good treatment for PTSD. And there's no homework, which I think is a great selling point, because if you don't assign homework, patients can't fail to do the homework. And if they don't, and what happens is, if they don't do the homework, they feel like bad patients. They can't do anything right. So the way affect-focused treatments like IPT get around this is they're 14 weeks for treatment. And so even though you don't assign homework, things come into focus. The patient says, oh, I guess I am angry about this. You may role play with the patient. How could they express that? But you don't say, now go out and do it. That's up to the patient. And the patient knows the clock is ticking week by week. So they generally go out and do it without being assigned homework they can fail. Does that make sense? So we did a study now a while ago about PTSD to see, is exposure really necessary? IPT has a couple of basic principles for those of you who don't know it. First of all, it has a medical model, which is important. And that says, you are not a defective person, which is the way many people feel with mood and anxiety and other disorders. You're not a defective person. You have an illness, and it's not your fault, and it's treatable. So if you're having trouble functioning, don't beat yourself up. Don't feel guilty. Those are symptoms. Blame the illness, and these are the symptoms of the illness you should know. And as you fight the syndrome, as you fight this diagnosis, you should get better. And you'll see you're not a bad person. So we give the patient a sick roll. That's a temporary sick roll for the course of the treatment, saying, you have a disorder, you have an illness, but we'll help you get out of it. And it is treatable, and you didn't ask for it. And with trauma, it's usually pretty clear that the patient didn't ask for it. There's usually an oppressor, or there's something way out of their control. So IPT, one thing is, you have an illness, don't beat yourself up. It's not you, it's what you have. And we can treat it. The other thing is, you want to link an interpersonal focus to that illness. You want to connect things that are happening in the patient's life with how they feel. It's a very pragmatic treatment. It's not particularly intrapsychic. You don't write down automatic thoughts. You don't deal with the unconscious. You don't deal with the transference. It's intrapsychic only in that we're interested in internal emotional responses to external circumstances. And patients actually kind of like that. And the focus is on resolving this focus, which is complicated grief or a role dispute or a role transition. And if you can fix your life, you're not only will your life be better, but your mood will be better too. Your symptoms will get better. And that turns out to work. And there are now 100 and something studies of IPT showing that that really works for mood disorders, for eating disorders, for some anxiety disorders. And now there are 13 studies, 8 of them randomized controlled trials for PTSD. So this is the basic paradigm. Mood and event are connected. If something really bad happens to you, your mood is going to get worse, right? We don't like bad things happening to us. And if your mood is bad, things don't go well in your life. It's harder to function and you feel worse. And when you feel worse, more bad things happen. So this is a potential vicious circle. And the way to reverse it is to have the patient do something good in their life, effectively improving things with a positive event. And if they can do that, it resolves the crisis they presented with, at least partially, and their symptoms and their feeling state improve. Now, this takes on a different, when we thought about expanding IPT to PTSD, we thought of all diagnoses, this is one that makes sense for IPT because you need an event to have the diagnosis, right? You need a trauma or it isn't PTSD. The challenge here is how do you handle huge feelings that derive from huge, upsetting, traumatic events? So it's a time-limited treatment. We arbitrarily made IPT 14 weeks, 14 weekly individual sessions for PTSD. Some other groups have varied that a little bit, but it's short. It's diagnosis targeted, although it's not just about the diagnosis, it's also about the person. It's forward-looking. You don't reconstruct the trauma as you do in an exposure therapy. You don't make the patient relive the horrors they've been through. You say, how has that affected you? How is that making the present and the future hard? How does that affect your social life? So it's much more, how do we get on from where you are? It addresses current problems. That's good for time-limited treatments. And now it's really empirically grounded. So the idea in this therapy is to elicit emotions. In this case, for people who have PTSD, often these are numb people and it's hard to do it. That's half the trick. You ask them, how do they feel? They say, I don't know. I don't feel anything. I'm numb. But you want to elicit emotions. You want to link them to life events, or vice versa. You want to elicit life events and link them to emotions. You want the patient to sit with those feelings. In a way, it's a kind of emotional exposure. And after a while, they say, oh, all right, I'm angry. All right, I'm really sad. They burst into tears. Or I'm really anxious. But they can, after a while, see that's not so dangerous. And that these feelings are actually useful social signals. They're not bad, which is how patients see them, but they're informative about what's going on in the patient's life. If your kibbutz just got blown up, maybe you should be kind of upset, not numb. This might present a problem for soldiers who need to go into battle and where numbness is actually a plus. But for the populace, I think this is a crucial thing to consider. So IPT helps patients understand their emotions, put them in an interpersonal context, in an environmental context, to see them as not bad, but as useful. and then ideally to act on them to make life better. How can you make trust possible again? How can you find safety for yourself and the people you care about? So there were already, when we started doing this back in the early 2000s, to adapt IPT to PTSD, there were already a bunch of exposure therapies around. We thought we don't need another one. And IPT really isn't an exposure therapy. It's not the way it's built. So we adapted IPT as a non-exposure treatment, focusing on patients' emotional numbness. Affective attunement. What are you feeling? Oh, I don't know. I don't feel anything. Well, surely, you know, when you saw this happen, you must have felt something. Or surely you don't even have to deal with the trauma. In fact, we don't particularly deal with the trauma. When you met your neighbor, when you were talking to your spouse, and things were not going well, you must have felt something. What do you call that? Well, I guess I was a little upset. Well, okay. Does that make sense? And what kind of upset? What do you call that? Because upset is a general description of negative affect. It's not specific. So anxiety is not the same as anger, is not the same as sadness, right? They mean different things. We also recognize that it had been pointed out for some time that patients who have been traumatized don't trust their environment. But we focused in particular on interpersonal hypervigilance. It's not just the environment. It's not just being near the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. It's the people. So the focus is not on reconstructing the trauma, but on using emotions to handle daily encounters with your family, with friends, with coworkers, with whomever you have contact with, to help patients figure out, how do I feel in that situation, and how can I use those feelings to decide whether I trust them or not? Some people, how do I know who are the trustworthy ones and who are the dangerous ones? So we did a pilot study of this. We treated 16 patients, just an open trial of 14 weeks of IPT. Everybody got better, basically. Now that happens in open trials. That doesn't necessarily prove anything. And the way we did this was, and this is standard IPT for those of you who are unfamiliar, every session after the first one, the patient comes in and you say, how have things been? How have you been since we last met? And that's a very simple question, but there are only two kinds of answers to that. One is, first of all, you're asking for an interval history since we last met, right? Since last week. What happened? How have you been? And so you get one or the other. People say something happened. You know, I was really upset about something. Or they say, I was really upset. And you want to link the two, right? If somebody says, well, it was my birthday last week, you want to know, how do you feel? Did that affect the way your mood went? And why? What happened? And if the patient gives you a mood, I've been feeling terrible, then you want to know what happened in the past week that might have made you feel worse. So after two questions, you have a recent, since we last met, affectively charged, mood connected to circumstance, life circumstance, which you can then dissect with the patient, reconstruct what happened there. What did you say? What did the other person say? How did you feel then? Then what happened? What did you feel then? What did you say? So you're putting together a kind of transcription with the patient of how do they handle daily encounters. It helps you understand how does the patient interact with other people, how might the patient handle things better? You explore specifics to elicit affect. Then what happened? And then what did you feel? And then what did you say? And you're listening also. Is there a disjunction between what the patient felt and what the patient actually said, right? Well, I was a little angry, but I wasn't going to say anything. So you're constantly linking emotion to the patient's environment or their role in the environment. We ask pretty simple questions like, what did you want to happen? How did you want this interchange to go? And then in contrast to what may actually have happened. What options do you have to get what you want? You know, you wanted something to happen. How do you get there? What can you do? And patients with mood disorders, with anxiety disorders, with PTSD are really often terrible at confronting other people and saying, please don't do that. I don't like that. They are equally terrible at saying, I would like to do this. That's selfish. That's greedy to announce your own needs. And depressed and traumatized people often feel lucky to be in any kind of relationship, and they're not going to jeopardize it by being too pushy. So one of the important things to find out from patients is, how do you fight with other people? When you don't agree, and not everybody agrees, nobody agrees with other people all the time. How do you negotiate that? What do you do? And what could you do if that doesn't work? So breaking down the conversations that patients have with other people is what we call communication analysis. You can give clarifications. Oh, so it sounds like you were angry then, is that right? You can role play with the patient then to say, well, what options do you have? How would you do that? What would you say? So you're not assigning it as homework, but you're prompting the patient to be able to handle an encounter, and they often need the practice desperately. So our interpersonal paradigm for PTSD is, if you felt safe before, once you've had a bad trauma, you don't feel safe. It shatters any sense of safety, and you then have a kind of global interpersonal mistrust. No one's really trustworthy. One of our early cases was somebody who was mugged at gunpoint in New York City subway. And he was afraid of the subway. He was afraid of, he couldn't use public transportation anymore. He lost his job because he couldn't get to work because of the transportation issue. But he also stopped talking to his wife. She's not the one who held him up in the subway, right? People withdraw because they don't trust anyone. And so we help patients see that, they have shut down their emotions. Trauma evokes an overwhelming affect and numbness. And if you're numb, you can't read your feelings and you don't know who to trust. So instead of reconstructing trauma, the focus in IPT is on the interpersonal consequences of having been traumatized. Where does that leave you with other people? How does that help you how does that hinder you, rather, from interacting with other people? And how can you restore trust where it's warranted, which is not with everybody, And how do you build social support, since we know that's really important? So we spent the early sessions of IPT on affective attunement. That is, asking patients, so what did you feel? You say you're numb, but surely you felt something. What do you call that? And there's a progression, if you push them enough, from, I guess I was a little bothered. I guess I was a little upset. I guess I was a little annoyed. Anger's important. Our mantra for this study was, emotions are powerful, but they're not dangerous. Sure, you go through something big and awful, you're going to have big and awful feelings, but the feelings aren't dangerous. The situation may have been. And then if they can tolerate their feelings, they can use them to read how their world is, and use those emotions to handle other people and take some control over their environment. So we encourage self-assertion, we encourage expression of anger, we elicit emotions, we let patients sit with them for a while, so it's not just an intellectualized exercise. We normalize the feelings. Well, is it okay to feel angry if somebody hurts you? If somebody attacks you? You get them to verbalize it so that they can respond to other people in a nonviolent way. And then you do role play to encourage patients to build these skills. How would you say that? And when they've said it, you say, so how was that? Did you say what you wanted to say? Is the content good? Did you, what about your tone of voice? Were you happy with that? You think that was angry enough? You think that was too angry? Have been hurt by somebody, that's part of trauma, much of the time. And you want them to be able to mobilize, first tolerate, but then mobilize their anger to confront other people and say, don't do that, I don't like that. And if you do that, if you can confront another person and say, I didn't like the way you handled this, I don't like the way you're treating me, you get one of two basic responses. Either the other person says, fuck you, and in which case, that's not a trustworthy person, right? Or ideally, the other person says, this is really ideally, I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm very sorry, I apologize. And it doesn't always go that smoothly, obviously, but some patients will say things effectively and have a workable enough relationship with another person that the other person says, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. And you never said anything before. But thank you for telling me, I apologize. I'm sorry. And other people may not be so forthcoming and may deny the circumstance, but their behavior may change anyway, right? We all know this. I did nothing of the sort, but then they stopped doing what they had been doing. So mobilizing anger is really important. What we say to patients is, if you break the rules, if somebody transgresses against a social code, that's something everyone agrees is wrong, then at the very least, you have a right to an apology. So there are a lot of IPT patients who say, after IPT, you owe me an apology. And sometimes they get it. The idea was, if you did all these things, focusing on affect now, not focusing on traumatic reminders or reconstructing the trauma, patients would feel better, they would handle situations better, and then, in fact, the traumatic reminders wouldn't bother them anymore. They would go down to the World Trade Center, they would fly in airplanes again, they would go into high buildings, the things that they were avoiding. And that turns out to be true. Okay, I've said this. I've said this. You're welcome to these slides. And then again, this is the message we really wanted to convey. Emotions are powerful, but they're not dangerous. Better to know how you feel and be able to use it than not. So we compared interpersonal therapy to prolonged exposure, Edna-Foas treatment, the gold standard, so-called, and the best studied of the exposure therapies. And we compared them both to relaxation therapy, which is an active control, actually, which is just progressive muscle relaxation and imagery. And it's a scripted therapy where the therapist does like 95% of the talking. So it's a psychotherapy where the patient doesn't really talk. We did a randomized controlled trial of 14 weeks of treatment, separate teams of therapists, independent evaluators. And the key study hypothesis was that IPT would not be more than minimally inferior to prolonged exposure. That's a statistical design, saying it had to be within 12.5 points. 10 points is not a significant difference on the scale, the clinician-administered PTSD scale. 15 points is definitely a significant difference. We split the difference and said if IPT is more than 12.5 points worse, it's at least minimally inferior. We ended up treating 110 unmedicated patients. Only 15% are married or cohabitating. Think about that. That's social isolation. Only a third were working full-time. They had multiple traumas, most of them interpersonal. Interpersonal traumas are worse than natural disaster kind of traumas. And you'll notice that more than a third had sexual traumas. This is a mixed group of traumas, not like all motor vehicle accidents or something. Half of these patients had current major depressive disorder, which is exactly what you expect to find. Depression and PTSD go together a lot. About half the patients had an Axis 2 diagnosis on the SCID-2. Most of them had prior treatment, which hadn't worked. And what we found is all three treatments worked. An effect size of over 0.6 is considered large. These are huge effect sizes. All three treatments worked. And you can see the clinician-administered PTSD scores going down for all three, but you can also see there's some differences. So the first question we wanted to know does IPT work for PTSD? And we thought it will be better than the relaxation therapy and no worse than prolonged exposure. And so it had to be less than 12.5 points less. It had to be within 12.5 points to not be inferior. And it was only 5.5 points less good, which is not clinically meaningful. So we were able to reject minimal inferiority of IPT, saying, at least in this study, they were equivalent. And in fact, as I'll show you, they were more in some ways. These are response and remission rates. You can see IPT is the red bar there, and actually had the highest response rate. That was a surprise. We thought it wouldn't be any better than prolonged exposure. You can see remission is low really for everybody. And this is the thing with PTSD. You can get a lot better and still have a bunch of symptoms. This was really interesting, not a surprise, although we could not put this in our grant because we knew the exposure therapist would not fund the grant if we said such a thing. But we knew it's more difficult to get people to expose themselves to trauma reminders than to work on their social lives and their feelings. And in fact, IPT had a considerably lower, it's not statistically significant, but it's clinically meaningful, lower dropout rate. If you had both, remember, half the sample of patients, half of the 110 patients had both PTSD and major depression. And if you had both and you got prolonged exposure, the exposure treatment, you had a 50% dropout rate. That's shocking. So the overall dropout rate for exposure is usually around 30%, which is high enough. But that's really surprising. And if you didn't have major depression, you did fine. You didn't drop out. Social functioning improved. Quality of life improved in all of the treatments. So I'm going to skip this, but we basically showed IPT is not working through exposure, which we knew would be a criticism of the study. We weren't secretly giving them habituation hierarchies. So we concluded exposure may not be needed to treat PTSD. IPT was not more than minimally inferior, is essentially equivalent, and in fact had lower attrition and a higher response rate, and was better for patients with who also had major depression. We said initially, this is an old slide, results need replication. Patients preferred IPT, even though it was the new kid on the block, not really tested. The other two therapies had been tested a lot more, and we could say a lot more about them. But the idea that you didn't have to do exposure and you got psychotherapy was very popular. We looked at different kinds of trauma, and we found that if you had a sexual trauma, you did better in IPT than in the other two treatments. And that makes a certain amount of sense. IPT is decide whom you can trust. It's made to order for sexual trauma, where exposure therapy is a little more of a blunt instrument. And if you've had a lot of years of childhood trauma, it's hard to pick out particular instances to focus on in reliving the trauma. There are just too many of them. If you got IPT and you got better, you stayed better. So we thought IPT worked. It seemed to work particularly well for patients who had comorbid depression, who had sexual trauma. We found a hippocampal volume finding that I don't believe it, but that IPT worked better for people who had smaller gray matter volume in their anterior hippocampus, take it or leave it. But so how might this work? What's going on here? And you will know Bert and Ernie. Social support is really important. If you go through something awful, you have a choice. Tough people try to keep it to themselves. I'm above this. I can manage it. I'm John Wayne. And they don't talk to other people about it. They try to suck it up. And some people do that fairly well up to a point, and then they don't. It's too much. But in any case, you're keeping something in like it's a terrible secret. I've been through something ghastly, and I'm just going to shut it down, compartmentalize it, and not be weak and share it with other people. So you're carrying around something that feels pretty terrible. I was sexually abused, or I had to shoot a kid who I thought had a bomb. What do you do with that? That's a tough one. The alternative is, if you go through something awful, you can talk to other people about it. And you can say, I have to tell you, I just had the worst thing happen in my life, right? And I hope you can just listen to me. You don't have to say anything. I need some support. If you do that, you process the trauma. You process the feelings of the trauma. You don't get PTSD. Social support is a protective factor against PTSD. And using social support in IPT helps relieve PTSD. There's a huge literature on this. There are newer references. And so we started to think about John Bowlby and attachment theory. And the idea that, you know, a kid, when a baby starts to crawl and walk, the or caretaker, and they often get nervous and they look back and the mommy or daddy or whoever says, "You're okay. Keep it up. You're good. What good crawling you're doing." And if you do that enough, the kid says, "Oh, all right, I live in a safe environment. I have people I can turn to if I'm nervous." And we call that secure attachment, repeated a million times. If you have secure attachment, you tend to trust other people. If you have secure attachment, you tend to have a bigger social network because there are more people you trust. And if you have secure attachment and something awful happens to you, you are previously conditioned to say, "Let me tell you about the horrible thing that happened to me." Whereas if you grow up under different circumstances where there aren't caring caretakers, where a parent says, where are you going? You come back here. What's the matter with you?
Ron, some of us have to run to the shelters.
Oh, okay. Wow. I will stick around. I don't know. I can't tell how many people are still here, but I will stay online until this resolves. I'm sorry that this is happening.
So, John, I think you start to understand our reality.
Well, I'm sorry to, that's an impressive demonstration. It's okay again? All clear?
Everything is okay, but it's you know, we got used to it. We go to the shelter, we stayed a few minutes, we go back, we keep our lives going on. I don't think many nations on earth can live this way.
It's not ideal, is it? How upsetting is that? I mean, how used to that can you get?
Yeah, I think it's a chronic trauma. It's going on, and for some people who live near Gaza Strip, they live this way for 10, 15 years. We have in the center near Tel Aviv, we have 1.5 minutes to run to the shelter. They have 15 seconds. Just imagine this. You know, you need to sleep in your shelter. So I see people are back, so you can keep going. Let's have another 5 minutes and then let people ask some questions. You can use the Q&A place and put your questions there, and I can read them to John and he can answer. So let's keep on.
Okay. So let me just rush through this then, and I can stay on. I'm not in a rush to get off.
Thank you.
We figured people with secure attachment would have good social networks and be more likely to use the social networks and be less likely to get PTSD. People who had poorer social networks were more anxious to begin with about confiding in other people, would be at greater risk for PTSD. It's just common sense. And we've done a study looking at some markers of social insecurity, separation anxiety, low reflective functioning, and we found that not only does IPT treat separation anxiety in adults, but it seems to sort of repair attachment. It helps people get more secure with other people, which is what the therapy is trying to do. So it needs to be further tested. And we have a problem in this country that the National Institute of Mental Health is no longer interested in anything clinical. So we're having trouble doing the research. But this is one way to think about this. How secure are you with other people? It's very different from the cognitive behavioral exposure paradigm. So, and then if something really bad happens, in a crisis, having a social network and an ability to mobilize it and to confide in other people is crucial, should be crucial, in averting psychopathology, including PTSD. And these are our late guinea pigs, actually. But just to show you that attachment's a basic mammalian trait. You take George out of his cage and he goes back to see Juliet. They're attached. These are all the people who helped in the study I was just telling you about. There is now more research. There are 13 studies treating more than 750 patients with PTSD, with IPT. That can't be right. That's 14, right? I have to fix that slide. I think it's 8 and 5. And in those studies, IPT is better than no treatment or a waiting list. Well, you hope so, right? I mean, that's a weak comparison. There are 2 studies now, one in civilians, one in veterans, military veterans, comparing IPT to prolonged exposure, and it's held up. It's working at least as well. The more recent veteran study, if anything, IPT looks better on all counts. And there's a study of IPT compared to sertraline, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and they both were equally effective for women with acute sexual trauma. So as a result of this, IPT, which was not considered an exposure treatment because it isn't, has nonetheless found its way into treatment guidelines. It needs more research, but it's looking good. So in summary, IPT focuses on the life events that war produces, also other life events. It links those events to powerful feelings that patients may be suppressing because they're just too uncomfortable, and they see them as bad rather than reasonable responses to terrible things. IPT normalizes those emotional responses, helps patients see emotions as helpful social indicators, as road signs, how can I manage things, rather than as bad feelings, and helps them to take appropriate action to fix their environment as much as you can. And you do that and you feel better, you feel in better control, and you often feel, there are at least some people I can now trust. So it's a different outlook on the world. So let me stop there. I have a million more slides. I could keep going, but I hope this has been helpful. I feel like I was a little disjointed. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. But I hope that was coherent. And if it wasn't, please tell me and ask me what I can correct.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for giving us from your time. And despite your health issue, you were there on time. And it's really helpful. We really need this kind of help now because we need very quickly to teach lots of people, lots of techniques. So thank you very much. I'll take the option to ask the first question, and then Anat and Hamutal go through the questions from Q&A and run you or themselves answer the questions. So my only question at that point is, since we are in a mass trauma and big number of people are traumatized, and we need very quickly to train lots of people, do you believe in a short version of IPT, like 3-5 meetings to treat trauma when you have too many people and not enough therapists?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. People used to say brief therapy doesn't work at all. How can you change a person in just a couple months, right? It has to be years. And that turns out not to be true. If you want to change character, maybe that's something else. And we're not very good at that. And a lot of character actually turns out to be Axis 1 disorders that you can treat in brief time. And one of the findings of the study that I didn't show you, of the PTSD study we did, is that people who came in with personality disorders left 14 weeks of treatment without them. So what does that tell you? That tells you people with PTSD look personality disordered, but may not be. So anyway, brief treatment can be quite brief. IPT for depression has been cut down to 8 sessions, or there's a form called interpersonal counseling, which is designed for non-clinicians, really, for like places where there are no clinicians. And anyone with a modicum of education who can read a manual, signs up for this, and it works surprisingly well. So, I don't think we know the answer, but sure, you could try less. Another way, a shorter course of treatment. You're asking patients to do a fair amount to treat PTSD, though, and I think 14 is a number of sessions we picked out of a hat, and we might easily have said 10, and that might have been fine, or 8, and I guess that could have been fine. We just don't know. Another way around another answer to your question, though, would be to think about group IPT, where you can, have, 8 people, 10 people in a room with 1 therapist or 2 therapists. And some of the studies that I cited are in fact group therapies, and they seem to work quite well. And they have the advantage of, if you have a homogeneous group, of building solidarity. So there was a Janice Krupnik did the first real randomized controlled trial of IPT for PTSD, group therapy for brutalized women from public health clinics around the Washington, D.C. area. So these are women they were mostly minority, they had low income, they had low education, they had been raped and tortured and you name it, all their lives, childhood abuse, adult abuse. And not only did they get better in treatment with fairly weakly trained IPT therapists, but the women said, it's us against the world. You know, they formed a real solidarity, and that probably is part of why it helped. You could do that with soldiers. You could do that with people from the same, village or kibbutz or whatever, if they're comfortable doing that. I mean, I don't. But if you have a group of people who share similar experiences, a group approach might work very well.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm going to combine two of the questions which are related. One is, what about the narrative forming? Don't people want to tell their story? And do you explore the traumatic event at all? During the middle phase, do you go into the affect related to the event?
Those are really good questions. We did not do that because we worried that if we really touched on the trauma, everyone would say, oh, so you were doing exposure therapy. And so what we did in our study, and you could be less strict, we were trying to be very pure, but what we did was to establish that there was a trauma, right? I mean, for PTSD, you need to have a criterion A of the diagnosis of PTSD is something ghastly, something truly horrible happened to you outside of expectable life. You thought you would die, or you saw somebody die, or whatever, or you were abused for your childhood. So we established that was there, because part of the plausibility of the study is to say, you've been traumatized. No wonder you're having trouble socializing and dealing with other people. How could you trust anybody after that? Your father beats you to a pulp every day. How you can't trust your father? Whom are you going to trust, right? So we established that the trauma was there, but having done so, the therapist never brought it up again. Came up in session 1. And thereafter, if the patient wanted to talk about it, the therapist isn't going to say, shut up. But look, I think the thing with PTSD is patients often don't want to talk about it. And this way they don't have to. And we thought maybe, that this would be this could be a lead-in for some patients who needed to get comfortable with their feelings, and then having gotten comfortable and feeling somewhat better would be ready to risk the more exposure-based kind of approach. It often isn't really necessary. So there may be some people like that. There is something called STARE therapy, which is another PTSD therapy developed by Marilyn Cloitra, which is sort of like IPT at the start, or sort of like dialectical behavioral therapy, where you help the patient recognize feelings and get some control over them, and then you enter more of an exposure treatment once they can manage the feelings a little bit. So that would be another kind of approach, but that's not what we did.
Right.
Did I answer both questions?
Another question is, how do you address guilt conditions which is prevalent in PTSD? How do you touch on that?
I guess the first question is the guilt warranted? Right? I mean, there are patients who, like, complicated grief. You know, my mother dies in the hospital, and either patients are always, who get depressed, always find something to be guilty about at the deathbed, right? So, oh, I will never forgive myself because I was hovering over my mother when she died, and she probably wanted to die in peace. Or I unfortunately had to go to the bathroom, and so I went out to the bathroom, and when I came back, my mother was dead, and I never got to say goodbye. You can't win, right? So some people are going to be guilty come what may. It's a symptom, and you want to identify it as a symptom after exploring it a little bit, you know, and you don't want to say to the patient, actually, well, don't be silly, that's just a symptom, but you can help them see that it sometimes is a symptom, and they can judge, is it, you know, do they need to be guilty or not? Is that just part of being depressed or traumatized? Then there are more complicated circumstances. If you participate in euthanasia, and particularly if it doesn't go well, you are likely to feel pretty terrible and guilty, right? Or if you are a soldier and you kill somebody who turns out to be an innocent, this happens, right? What do you do with that? And you don't want to say, oh, you're exonerated, you know, you're forgiven. I mean, first of all, who are you to tell the patient that? And we really, this is a point I did not make. We really encourage autonomy. We don't talk down to patients. We don't give them homework. We don't tell them what to do. We really say, what do you think? You know, rather than giving a patient a directive, you can ask a question, which steers them in the same direction. So how do you deal with having shot a child? I mean, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that myself, but you have to have complicated feelings about that. And it would be worth exploring that. And a lot of patients, they come out of this numbness and they have a remarkably narrow vocabulary for emotion. And in fact, there is a range of emotion, and you can have more than one at the same time, right? So I had to protect myself and my comrades. We thought the kid had a bomb. And I feel terrible I shot an innocent kid. I mean, those are both true, right?
No, so what we see a lot now in the lots of the people that were removed from the kibbutz to the center of Israel, and we treat them now, it's a survivor guilt. I survived, my whole family died, and I feel guilty because I tried to struggle for my life, and maybe I could save someone else. This is the main issue we hear all the time, the guilt
Really?
of the survivors.
That's a tough one. And look, I don't think you want to give somebody a simplistic answer. You know, you can't just say, oh, it's okay. Good, you survived. Some of that is usually luck of the draw, right? You're in the right place at the right time, or other people are in a worse place. You can do what you can do. And people don't always react perfectly in a crisis, right? I mean, some people are heroic and some people are less heroic. But what you want to do, and again, we're not really focusing on the trauma here, right? I mean, I feel like you're drawing me into that with this example. But how do you, it would be more important with somebody like this, I think, to say, what do you do with that guilt? Do you keep it to yourself? Are you sharing it with other people? You know, I mean, a lot of other people probably have been through similar situations, right? So you're really much more focused on the present and on the consequences of having been traumatized. I mean, I would imagine my sense from talking to a few Israelis has over the last few weeks has been everybody's affected, right? I mean, everyone who is alive has some level of guilt. Or maybe that's a little overstated, but you know what I mean. So this would be a good topic for discussion. I don't know what the answer is, but it's something people should talk about.
Let's move on. We have a few more questions. Do you want to go through them?
Yeah, so I think a very big one is how can you get people to trust others again when they lost that capacity?
We don't talk about the government, yes?
Yeah, the government. We have a problem with that too. Look, it's a central issue. I think it's the interpersonal issue of PTSD. And how do you get other people to trust? It generally, the paradigm tends to be this. The patient initially says, I don't feel anything. I'm just wandering through life. You get them to see that they, in fact, have feelings. Some of the feelings aren't pleasant feelings. Some of the unpleasant feelings are anger. And anger usually means somebody's not treating you very well. And so if you can get the patient prepared to confront these people who are making them angry, they sort out, right? Some people will apologize and some people will not. And the ones who don't apologize, you don't have to deal with. And the ones who do apologize, you might have a bond with. So that's how we do it anyway, isn't it? And the disadvantage that people with PTSD tend to have is that they don't read the feelings. So they don't confront people, or they confront them so dramatically, you know, they're like a pot under pressure and they blow up, and the anger is so great that it loses the issue. All people see is that they're really too angry. So if you can help the patient acknowledge what they don't like and help prepare them to be able to say, I don't like that, don't do that. You hurt my feelings when you do that. And the verbs there are important. You have to mention your feelings. It's not like this situation sucks. It's, I don't like it when you do this. Because if you say to somebody, this situation sucks, the other person can say, no, it doesn't. That's a matter of opinion. But if you say, I don't like it, it's hard for the other person to say, yes, you do. So your feelings count.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure, I'm not going anywhere.
So the question is, in your experience, how important is the time that passes between the trauma and the treatment? Is that an important factor?
Yeah. I mean, in several ways. I mean, first of all, the duration of the trauma itself matters, right? So if you have to have a trauma, let it be brief. You know, one car accident. And if you have a car accident as an adult, that means you've had the chance to grow up without trauma. And you have a fully developed personality, and hopefully you have the attachment skills, the attachment security to have a social network to turn to. So you say, I have to tell you about the horrible car accident I was in. If trauma comes early and is chronic, that's obviously worse than an acute trauma. And this is one of the worst disorders for time delay to treatment. So the worst, to my knowledge, is separation anxiety, because it's sort of egocentric. Like the whole family says, well, of course everyone sleeps in the same bed, you know, that's, and we have to. But PTSD, and the average time for separation anxiety to treatment, I think, is 12 years. The average time for PTSD is about 8 years. And in our study, it was 14. So these are patients who try not to get treatment. Either they don't think they need it, they think it's sort of who they are, which is a problem in psychiatry, right? You confuse your symptoms with yourself. Or they're afraid of treatment. They think that means they're crazy, or whatever. We have, you know, the World Trade Center attack was in 2001, and we still have patients presenting to treatment for the first time with World Trade Center trauma. This is now 20 plus years later. So there are a lot of people who really avoid treatment. They're avoidant. And the longer it goes, the more ingrained these things are. So ideally, you want to catch it early. And that's why it's great you are trying to address trauma as it's arising, rather than waiting a decade, which would be more the way we do things around here.
Okay, John. First of all, thank you very much again.
Sure.
Thank everybody that attended this meeting. It will be unforgettable because of the alarm in the middle. I wish to thank also Hamutal Saragusti and Professor Anat Bronstein-Klomek for joining me to this project. We will have your recorded talk on Thursday in GEA website, so everybody can approach it, those who had to leave in the middle or those who ran to the shelter. And I recommend your excellent book on IPT, on PTSD. The three of us already read it, but I recommend all the others to read this important book and understand more and more the principles of this treatment. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate your time.
Look, you're very welcome. I mean, you were in a terrible place, and you're very brave. And if there's anything we can do here, we want to do it. So if I can be helpful in some other way, please let me know.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
We will probably ask you to help us again. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care.